you started to feel it yet?
What did you do to me?
Your body is going to shut down soon. Once it kicks in, you have about 20 minutes before you're completely paralyzed. At minute 1, your fine motor skills will start to go. At minute 10, your legs will begin tingling. That means your gross motor skills are next. Minute 15, your legs will give out altogether. And just before everything shuts down on you, your voice. Ma'am.
In the opening scene, we meet Iris, the protagonist, who is struggling with the overwhelming grief of losing her young son, Matteo, in a tragic hiking accident. This devastating loss has left her feeling helpless and deeply depressed. Seeking an escape from her pain, Iris grabs a hiking knife and leaves her phone behind before setting out. She drives miles away from the city and arrives at a park, where she begins a solitary climb up a rugged trail. When she finally reaches the clifftop where Matteo's accident took place, Iris collapses under the weight of her sorrow, clutching a framed photo of Matteo as silent tears fall. She gently places a small toy boat at his memorial, then walks to the edge of the cliff. Standing there, she gazes down, consumed by grief and considering jumping off to end it all. At that moment, a calm-looking man approaches and introduces himself as Richard. He explains that he noticed the memorial, and like her, seeks solitude, gently inserting himself into her space. However, Iris, determined to end her sorrow, quietly asserts, "You can't stop me." In response, Richard begins to share his own story, revealing that he also lost someone close, his girlfriend, Chloe, in a car accident. Offering her sympathy, Iris says softly, "I'm sorry." Richard goes on to describe how the accident left him paralyzed for months, trapped in a hospital bed, desperately wanting to escape his own trauma. Richard then bitterly remarks how visitors only expressed shallow sympathy for his loss, merely offering pity and repeating the empty phrase, "I'm sorry." Recognizing the shared pain between them, Iris finally reveals the tragic story of her son's death, expressing a deep regret that it should have been her life lost instead of his. Richard empathizes, acknowledging that they are both broken, but urges her not to lose hope. As he turns to leave, he assures her he isn't trying to change her mind, only to give her something to consider. Before he walks away, Iris confirms her name, and Richard departs, leaving her alone to grapple with her decision. After her conversation with Richard, Iris begins to rethink her decision. She catches up to him along the trail, walking with him back toward their parked cars. Upon reaching the vehicles, Iris says goodbye and heads toward her car. However, with Richard's car parked close beside hers, she struggles to open her door. Suddenly, Richard steps out, holding an umbrella, and unexpectedly attacks her with a stun device. As Iris is momentarily incapacitated, he quickly secures her wrists and ankles with zip ties, and places her in the back seat of his car. Iris regains consciousness as Richard drives them along a desolate road. Attempting to call for help, she tries to activate her phone's emergency SOS, but Richard quickly notices her movement. He informs her that there's no cellular service in this remote area, and that her phone isn't even within reach, making her efforts futile. As he talks, he cryptically describes her predicament as a case of wrong place, right time, and shows her a toy boat she had left at a memorial site. This prompts Iris to remember the pocket knife tucked in her back pocket. Carefully, she retrieves it and begins cutting through the zip ties binding her wrists. To keep Richard distracted, Iris starts a conversation about his girlfriend, Chloe. He soon reveals that Iris is not his first victim, exposing himself as a serial killer who hides his true nature behind a friendly facade. He tells her he's taking her to a secluded cabin where they'll have all weekend together. Working quickly and quietly, Iris manages to cut through the ties on her wrists. In a desperate move, she attacks Richard with the knife, causing him to lose control of the car, which crashes into a tree. Even after the crash, Richard lunges at her, and they engage in a struggle. Iris fights back fiercely, eventually managing to escape the vehicle and free her ankles from their restraints. Desperately, Iris begins shouting for help. In response, Richard, disturbingly calm, asks, "Have you started to feel it yet?" Confused, she demands to know what he means. Richard then reveals a syringe, explaining that, during their struggle, he injected her with a paralyzing agent. He details how the drug will gradually take away her ability to move over the next 20 minutes. First, within the initial minute, she'll lose fine motor skills, preventing her from doing anything precise, like holding a knife or dialing a phone. By 10 minutes, she'll lose control of her larger muscles, making walking or sitting upright impossible. At 15 minutes, she'll be entirely immobile, and finally, by the 20-minute mark, she'll lose even her voice. With this information, Iris realizes the severity of her situation and understands that she has limited time to escape, before the paralysis takes full effect. Iris bolts into the woods, while Richard follows at a leisurely pace, confident the injection will soon disable her. Testing her fine motor skills, she tries counting by flexing her fingers but soon realizes she's already lost precise control over them. Acting quickly, Iris sets a timer on her watch to track her remaining time, and continues her desperate escape. After 3 minutes, she starts to lose gross motor control, affecting her larger muscle groups and causing her to limp. She hides under a large tree root at one point, but Richard, still moving slowly, easily keeps up. As she hides, a swarm of ants begins crawling over her, biting her skin and pushing her to the edge of endurance. Forced to act, she makes a daring decision to crawl toward a nearby river, even though it risks revealing her location to Richard. Just in time, Iris manages to drag her body into the river, and lets herself float downstream, lying on her back. Richard watches from the bank, taunting her, saying that soon she won't be able to move her arms or legs to swim. The river eventually carries her downstream, where her weakened body gets caught against a large log. Summoning the last of her strength, she pulls herself onto dry land. As Iris lies motionless, she hears the faint sound of a motor nearby. Having lost her voice along with nearly all movement, she's unable to call for help and can only cling to hope. She has washed up on an isolated property belonging to an elderly man named Bill, who discovers her while mowing his lawn. Concerned, Bill approaches her and asks how she ended up there, then notices the timer on her watch, which has just completed the 20-minute countdown. Realizing she can see and hear him despite being unable to speak or move, Bill figures out that they can communicate through her blinking, once for yes, twice for no. Bill gently lifts her into a wheelbarrow, brings her inside, and prepares to call 911. Suddenly, there's a knock on the door. Seeing who it might be, Iris blinks urgently, signaling her fear. When Bill opens the door, he finds Richard, who appears distressed and claims he's looking for his wife, explaining she went missing after a car accident. Bill, however, doesn't mention about Iris to Richard, and advises him to stay out, sensing something off about him. Richard, however, steps inside, looking around and claiming to be distraught and confused. Bill offers to help but asks Richard to wait outside, though Richard insists on using Bill's phone, saying he lost his own. This time, Richard introduces himself as Andrew, which raises Bill's suspicions further, prompting him to ask more questions. Casually, Bill asks, "What's your wife's name?" Momentarily catching Richard off guard, but he quickly recovers, saying her name is Chloe. Unseen by Richard, Iris lies motionless behind the couch, able to hear their conversation, and desperately blinking to signal Bill. Richard continues his story, adding that his wife suffers from a medical condition that can leave her disoriented, or even catatonic in stressful situations. Starting to believe him, Bill is about to mention about Iris, when he hears a phone ring, Richard's phone, despite his earlier claim of having lost it. This confirms Bill's suspicions about Richard's dishonesty. Realizing his cover is blown, Richard demands to know where Bill has hidden Iris, noting that the wheelbarrow he'd seen is inside the house, rather than outside in the garden. Bill, however, quickly lies, saying Iris is back at the shed, and firmly tells Richard they both need to leave his property. When Richard turns his attention to the shed, Bill seizes the moment and shoves him aside. As Richard stumbles, Bill scrambles to grab the phone and dials 911, urgently reporting a dangerous intruder. A fierce struggle erupts, and in a brutal turn, Richard manages to grab a knife and fatally stabs Bill multiple times. Iris, helpless, watches in horror as Bill collapses on the floor. With Bill now out of the way, Richard storms toward the shed, only to discover it empty. Frustrated, he retrieves a gasoline container, and Iris, paralyzed with fear, watches as he returns, intent on finishing what he started. Richard then douses the house in gasoline, grabs Bill's truck keys, sets the house ablaze, and leaves. As the flames spread, Iris feels mobility slowly returning to her hands. She tugs at a window blind cord, hoping to alert someone, and the movement catches Richard's attention. He rushes back inside, spotting Iris lying behind the couch. With the fire consuming the house and Bill's body, Richard carries Iris out, and drives away in Bill's truck with her fate still hanging in balance. While driving away, Richard receives a call from his daughter, who eagerly shares her report card news, and mentions she and her mother plan to visit the cabin that weekend. Handing the phone to his wife, Richard gets into an argument about their unexpected visit. Eventually, he reluctantly agrees, and his wife confirms they'll arrive at 10 o'clock, a change that means he and Iris won't have the cabin to themselves all weekend. A moment later, Richard stops at a service station to refuel, just as the 911 response team speeds toward Bill's house. As Iris slowly begins to regain mobility, she spots people around the station, and a flicker of hope ignites within her. She manages to unhook her seatbelt but despite her desperate struggles, remains unsuccessful to open the truck door. Noticing her movement, Richard hurries back, jumps into the truck, and drives to his wrecked car to retrieve some belongings. While he's occupied, a police officer arrives, approaches the truck, and knocks on the window. Iris, still partially paralyzed, can only produce faint, incoherent sounds. Spotting the officer, Richard quickly intervenes. The officer runs the truck's registration and mentions a 911 call, expressing his need to speak with Iris. Richard, attempting to divert suspicion, explains that his wife had wrecked the car while drunk. When the officer asks about the truck, Richard claims it belongs to his friend Bill. However, his failure to call 911 after the supposed accident raises the officer's suspicions. At that moment, Iris manages to roll down her window, and the officer walks towards the truck to speak with her. She whispers a faint, desperate help, prompting the officer to inspect further. The officer notices the zip ties and syringe inside the truck, and as he reaches for his gun, Richard strikes him suddenly and violently with a heavy iron object, landing blow after blow until the officer collapses lifelessly. Seizing the officer's gun, Richard coldly sets both the patrol car and his own wrecked vehicle ablaze to eliminate any evidence, then climbs back into the truck and drives away, leaving the burning wreckage behind. As Iris gradually regains her voice, she tries to appeal to Richard's conscience, suggesting he lost his sanity during his long, bedridden months in the hospital. Richard counters, claiming he found a sense of clarity, realizing his disbelief in God after watching Chloe lie helplessly during the accident. Sensing the danger, Iris pleads with Richard to let her go, promising to forget everything if he leaves her by the roadside. Richard, however, dismisses her plea, saying, "It's not that easy." He then reverses the truck and drives the immobile Iris towards a nearby river. In a desperate moment, Iris strikes Richard with a syringe, but she's unable to inject its contents. Richard easily removes the syringe, calmly explaining that the drug's retrieval properties gives a brief burst of energy but quickly wears off, leaving the body too weak to sustain it. He then gets out of the truck and retrieves a knife from the trunk as Iris cries out in frustration. Richard then drags immobile Iris to a secluded boat jetty, intending to row her out to the spot where he has disposed of his previous victims. His cold plan becomes clear as he prepares to leave her immobile body in the water's depths. While in the boat, Iris notices Richard is armed with both a knife and a gun. Sensing an opportunity, she begins to cry, asking him for one last favor, to retrieve her son Mateo's toy boat from her back pocket. Richard reluctantly agrees, leaning forward to reach it. As he does, Iris seizes the moment, grabs a knife, and stabs him in the neck, severely injuring him. A struggle ensues, and Richard reaches for his gun, but Iris violently rocks the boat, causing him to lose his balance and fall overboard, leaving the gun behind in the boat. As he attempts to climb back on, Iris takes the gun and shoots him with his own gun, piercing the boat's hull in the process. Richard drifts away, struggling against the current. Believing she's finally escaped danger, Iris allows herself a brief moment of relief. However, it's quickly shattered as water begins flooding into the boat through the bullet hole in its hull. With the boat sinking and her strength returning, Iris makes one final effort to save herself. Moments later, she surfaces and swims back to the jetty, narrowly escaping. Standing ashore, she reflects on her journey from wanting to end her life to fighting for it, finally reconciling with her grief over Mateo's death. A little farther down the shore, Richard has managed to drag himself onto the bank, bloodied and weakened. Iris stands over him, watching as his life fades away. With a quiet, steady voice, she thanks him, not for the pain he caused, but for something unexpected. Through her desperate struggle to escape him, she has rediscovered her own will to live.